We have our wonderful panelists here, and you may know some of them from earlier. So we have Barak Travasky, who has a ton of experience in AI, 25 plus years, understanding LMs, and I'll let him dive into his experience a little bit more as he gave a brief overview earlier. And we also have, yeah, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Aku. I think I was up on stage earlier, but lovely to meet all of you again here.
Hi, folks. I'm Priya Sai-Prasad. I'm a partner at SoftBank Vision Fund and excited for this panel.
So one of the important things to know is that when it comes to investing, people invest at different stages. Like Priya, you invest in later stage companies. And not everybody is looking at early stage companies that are ready to grow or maybe even just trying to find product market fit. So there's a lot that we're here to learn. So I would like to first start with some of the characteristics that Priya, that you see in startups, particularly in generative AI, that you find attractive and you say, oh, these are some of the characteristics that I would invest in.
No, it's a great question. So from a stage perspective, we're typically Series B and above. So at that stage, we look for product market fit. We also look for customer traction and customer proof points in terms of the ROI that the product is ultimately delivering. And if the product is so sticky enough that customers actually want to renew and they want to buy additional modules, et cetera. So definitely more of the financial side of the house that we look for. Although I will state that with the evolution of Gen AI technology in general, it's taking a little bit longer in some cases to get to traction. And so there's definitely Series B, Series C rounds that are being done for companies that have $0 of revenue so far, right? And that's definitely, I would say, however, from the way we look at it, it's a little bit more of the exception than the norm. And so still we look for sort of customer proof points. Even if it's not fully monetizable at this point, we want reference calls with customers in order to understand that they truly see value in the product.
So when you look at the scalability of an AI generative solution, what are some of the things that come to mind when you're saying, hey, I think there's a solid market size here? And you may see something where sort of have a land and expand market size, a beachhead strategy, where they start with one customer segment, but really is to expand into maybe 20 different customer segments. And I would love for whoever wants to take this question, this is up for grabs as well, and go from there.
I will mostly focus on wearing my product executive hat because I'm not an investment team and scale. I'm focusing on AI strategy and thought leadership on a fund level. But in general, I always look at two dimensions, not only market size, meaning the opportunity size that you need to look at it, and there's different measurement. It could be number of users, could be revenue, but also potential to realize, is the use case ready? Do you have, as a company, do you have the right skill set, data, people, etc.? And back to the frameworks that I showed before is that specifically in LLMs, it's very important to understand whether the use case is ready. For example, as I mentioned, use cases where you're relying on, let's say, I mean, most famous is probably search. When accuracy is a premium, the LLM might actually not be ready for a scalable deployment. And the use cases that are more creative in nature are much more ready for scalable deployment. So I think it's very important to understand and be really honest to understand whether the use case LLM actually leverages the strengths of LLM versus wishful thinking. I believe we are in a bit of a hype of demos right now, meaning people will just take a use case, think about the mainstream journey, connect it to ChatGPT 4 and demo it, but that might be 10, 20% of the use case. To productize it, you really need to look at the entire use case and understand what's the main value.
Yeah, those are some great points. So I've run like an accelerator before focused on AI startups, incubating AI startups. And I've also been an investor and also more into product exec hat. So I'm going to first take on more of like the product hat. And I just want to say in terms of like startups, like data is the holy grail of everything. And that's one of the reasons, like about a few years ago, I worked with Shalu, who was going to be here, but she's not well. But she's the managing director of Microsoft for Startups. We worked together to like find a place so startups and corporates could collaborate with each other, and organizations like Microsoft have this large data sets, and that's why it's very beneficial for startups to partner with them. So that was the whole thesis of that. Right now I'm advising a lot of the startups, and one of them is a startup called the AI Foundation. They did the campaign for Biden, and they also have something called Digital Deepak. So there's some really interesting use cases there, all of them in the space of Gen AI, and they're also expanding into things like employee productivity. How can you help employees engage better with Gen AI? So that's some interesting use cases that are coming into the market right now, and it's evolving. So it's definitely a very interesting time. Gen AI has definitely become this co-pilot for everybody to make all of our jobs easier as well. So that's also exciting.
And going off of that note, like you said, many of you are either on the board of advisors for companies. I know, Priya, you are on a board of advisors for a number of companies that are in the AI space and investing in the AI space. And I'd like to talk to you about whether you're advising or have invested in, what are some of the startups that have stood out to you, and what were their characteristics, and what were those, I would say, maybe metrics or other variables that you're like, I think they get it?
There's sort of this age-old saying with software, and I've been a software investor for a while now, but are you a vitamin or a pill? And are you a must-have, nice-to-have? Is it a feature, or is it like an end-to-end solution? And so the same thing actually holds true with the entire Gen AI craze now, right? Ultimately, what's the pain point that you're solving? Is there a budget? Will someone in some organization pay for it? And that in some ways actually showcases that it is sort of a pain point and not a vitamin. Right? And so that's definitely one thing that I see with all the companies that I've invested in and I'm on the board of. It is a fundamentally validated need that customers are struggling with today. So that's the first point. The second one is ROI is something that I can't stress enough, which is, what does your software, your solution, what does it actually offer the end user in terms of either additional revenue, either cost savings, enhanced productivity, and what was that in comparison to the status quo, and what is that in comparison to the current competitive landscape, right? So getting both of them right, I feel like is getting close to the holy grail. But the tricky part is, the earlier the company is in your life cycle, you're experimenting, right? You're interviewing a bunch of prospective customers. You're trying to iterate and understand exactly what that pain point is. And the product is going to evolve, and the journey of what you're targeting is going to evolve, and that's completely fine. That's why seed and Series A investors look for something quite different than what we tend to look for.
One aspect that I'm tracking closely, that I believe it's a bit overlooked aspect of LLMs, is the importance of robust data retrieval or information retrieval system, because LLMs are really great in reasoning and summarizing. But if you pass irrelevant or not great content in your context window, you will get very well summarized crap. It will basically classical garbage in, garbage out, just very nicely presented. And obviously, back to my point that I made earlier, people tend to get carried away when crap is presented very well and confidently. So that makes it even more difficult. So I think companies that understand the dependencies of making sure that you pass the relevant data as context. In many cases, an enterprise use case, it means you need to connect LLM to internal or external data sources. And there is a ton of stuff there that could be conflicting, irrelevant, etc. So it's super important for both startups that working on that, but startups that want to create scalable LLM applications at scale. I think they need to pay very close attention to this retrieval aspect of that is connected to LLMs. You could call it retrieval, you could call it search, you could call it knowledge graph, you can call it indexing, but robust system to retrieve relevant information and pass it to LLM for reasoning and summarization is key.
Yeah, I totally agree with both Priya and Barak. Those are some amazing points. I just want to add one thing that I really look for is, first of all, does the customer have a real pain point? That's one of the most important things. And what I do is put together a product advisory council, a board of advisors for the particular product to identify what are the pain points the customers are facing. One of the products that I launched at Data Robot was MLOps governance in the space of trusted AI. And that was heavily driven by external market conditions at that time. That was a time when there were a lot of our customers were having lawsuits on things like discrimination and risk management failure, like Citibank and JP Morgan and some others. So what this came into the play is like a new product line for a whole different new persona, which is the chief risk officer, the chief auditing officer, someone who didn't have access to artificial intelligence tools, because there were tons of tools for the data scientists, but not much for this new persona. And that's something that I was able to build, just come in and identify this whole new persona that had a real pain point, backed by these external market regulations at that time. And the reason I'm explaining this is another important thing is the timing. Is it the right time for the market? So that's another important consideration to take into account while, building a product or.
And going off of that, when we think of timing and we think of market feasibility, one of the things that also comes to my head is technical ability. So when we're evaluating the technical ability of a startup, especially at different stages, right? At early stage in the AI space, it may look much different. You may not have a team of engineers. And it's like you're measuring product market fit, customers, versus having actual technical defensibility. And in the later stages, you may be more focused on that. So when you're evaluating the technical feasibility, and I would say using that as a barrier to entry, and also just seeing how well the startup excels in it and how well the founders excel in it, what comes to mind and how important is it at the different stages of the startup's life cycle?
Sure, it's a great question. I mean, ideally, the dream scenario would be that you've built this incredible tech moat and there's a massive barrier to entry and no one else can enter in. And the later stage the company gets, the more intense that moat gets. The reality is, with so much open source stuff available nowadays, it's actually unrealistic, in my opinion, to have the most defensible tech moat at any stage of the company's life cycle, especially as even more innovation arises, right? So the reality is, okay, we're gonna accept open source. It's something that it's going to be part of our entire tech architecture. But how do we add our own spin on it such that it's hard to replicate? It's something that Akriti said earlier, which is data. And what I mean by that is some parts of your data is going to be proprietary and some is not going to be proprietary, right? It's almost that that ratio of what the proprietary to open source actually looks like. And if you're able to actually have access to a bunch of historical customer data for whatever reason, that's actually pretty phenomenal, because that fine tunes your models infinitely better, right? So it's almost making a bespoke stack and keeping that stack as bespoke as possible for as long as possible until you start building network effects associated with your models and associated with having an end-to-end platform. So I guess my broader comment would be, having ultimate 100% defensibility is just not the reality of the environment that we're living in. But being able to create something bespoke such that you at least have certain aspects of defensibility is definitely going to help in the long term.
Yeah, totally agree with Priya. And just to add to that, I believe if you dig deeper, I believe that for startups today, it's unrealistic to have AI mode, because if you look at a very simplistic level, you have three aspects of potential modes or potential proprietary advantage. One is train AI models. This is definitely effectively commoditized. Second one is data. I believe unless it's a very specific use case, maybe, I don't know, healthcare because of the privacy regulation, or, I don't know, national defense, there are enough data sources today. It's becoming harder, but it's not impossible to achieve. We see that a lot of people train on Reddit or other data. And finally, the last one that is defensible, but it's a big player game. It's the compute infrastructure. That's a big, big, big dependency, but that's more or less a play of Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and NVIDIA. That will be fine. That being said, as Priya said, there are other aspects of defensibility. It could be really deep understanding of the use case. It could be go-to-market. It could be relationship if it's enterprise. And I think on a technical side, it might not be AI defensibility, but the technical side, you might have something that is in combination with other aspects that I mentioned could be defensible. I gave an example of robust retrieval system. That's very hard to build. I mean, unless you're Google or Amazon, most of other big companies in commerce, healthcare, etc., the retrieval systems are not great. And small startups can try to build it for a specific use case. Probably not. I would not recommend anyone to try to compete with Google. That's suicidal. But there are a ton of vertical applications where vertical enterprise search never made sense because it was not a big business. It might become more important when you combine it with LLM.
I just want to take a moment really quick to introduce Richard Chen, who's the founder of Iterative Ventures. Iterative Ventures is made up of former Meta employees, and they focus on investing in the newest technology, particularly AI.
Yeah, exactly. So frontier technologies specifically, so that encompasses blockchain, AI, et cetera. So a little bit about my background, and I think we're touching upon the topic of defensibility. This is a question I think about a lot, but before that, I spent 4.5 years at Facebook, ranging from data scientist, data engineer, software engineer. So kind of ran a gamut of things. Used to deploy a neural network and dabble a little bit into blockchain last year. Now, regarding defensibility, I would agree with all of the comments from other panelists. And I would like to also add, especially with my bias coming from Meta, one of the things that I observed with Meta in which they build defensibility is the economy of scale, right? So in this case, having their system vertically integrated within your company all across the stack stuff, for example, such as in A/B testing, for example, there's a stack where we could just insert into variables within the code, in which case then you can get time series of data and you get to measure the performance almost real time. And because of that, Facebook was able to achieve move fast and break things and able to iterate really fast, staying very obsessed to what the customers need, et cetera, based on data and so on and so forth. So that's one aspect I want to emphasize on.
And one of the things I want to dive into is talking about the future of AI startups, and particularly what makes you guys excited. So when we look at verticals in AI, it goes across every single industry, right? And I think it can be a bit overwhelming. People are like, okay, well, it applies to everything. And but what are you each particularly interested in terms of verticals? And Richard, we'll start with you.
I think what really excites me is the way that we interact with computers and technology. In this case, because of the way that generative models are able to basically take in what's called reinforced learning human feedback. It's able to train and basically sending input. So then in that case, we can get the results in ways that we previously couldn't through whether it's search, et cetera. And because of that, it severely improved or drastically improved rather the user experience. And so in which case I see that there could be fundamental changes across different industries, especially for industry that you might otherwise have to, let's say, take a long time to understand the subject matter. So in this case, for example, I'll just give you an example where I was looking into tax, for example, information, and I was able to get the answer really quickly from ChatGPT, for example. Another example would be that previously I wanted to design a system, and I basically can just write the spec for ChatGPT to generate that piece of code for me. Albeit, the generation right now is still not perfectly accurate. It does suffer from AI incoherence, for other products, toxicity, bias, et cetera. But I think that we're took a huge step since when I was deploying models to today.
Yeah, to try to predict the future, which is VCs pretend to do, is, as I mentioned, I published an article about a framework to evaluate AI applications or AI use cases. And now I'm looking at industries that will be impacted. So I mentioned the first industry, which is entertainment. And I kind of outline why I believe they'll be the first to be disrupted. The next article, the next areas, or maybe even buckets of areas, would be what I call customer-facing interactions across many industries, meaning sales, calls, chats, emails, customer service, marketing. That's taken industry, financial services, utilities, healthcare, any industry. It will be big impact there. Next one, I believe, is coding. You will see big transformation of coding. There is a ton of research that shows that it's not only improving productivity, but also improving satisfaction of software developers. And it's a good use case for LLM because it's a language. It's very structured language. Our language is very unstructured. It's very, it has leading Google Translate. You have rules and you have exceptions to the rules and exceptions to exceptions. That's why it's so hard. And when the language is much more structured, then it's a pseudo language, but it's much easier for LLMs to handle. And finally, we already see it. Education, I think, will be disrupted. You already see companies like Chegg are being affected both in the public market. Companies like Pearson, companies like others that are basically doing education, certification, all the space will be disrupted significantly. That's kind of my crystal ball for today.
Yeah, those are some great points. Definitely agree with on that. In terms of the verticals that could be, I definitely agree. Sales is definitely an area which could be improved. Talk about generative AI creating a pitch deck for you, or helping you figure out how to engage with a potential client, or even helping you figure out like what to say to a potential client. I think that's really interesting. Like almost a decade ago when I was working at IBM Watson, insurance was a vertical that we really focused on. Some of the customers like Nationwide Insurance that heavily used IBM Watson to help their, insurance agents. And now fast forward a decade, like we have generative AI. So much more can be done in that field of even insurance, where we could have insurance agents benefit a ton with helping them answer questions. I think this can also be extended to other areas like call center and whatnot. So, I mean, personally, generative AI is going to be a co-pilot for all of us in our jobs. So that's super, super interesting, whether you want to create a pitch deck or whether you want to write a blog or an email, like you could or if you want to write a program, ChatGPT is always with you. So that's always exciting.
So as a software investor, we sort of saw the first wave of software, which I'd categorize now as, call it your sales forces, right? And then we saw the second wave of software, which I would categorize it in that same category of sales tech as the outreach sales lofts of the world. And now I think we're in the third iteration of software, where how much more productive can you make this particular line of business user, right? And so that across the board, if you take a classic enterprise, I tend to look at line of business and where the budget comes from. So HR software, marketing software, sales software, finance software, all of that is ripe for disruption, right? And step function gains from the advancement in generative AI coupled with software. So I think there are categories that could be entirely disrupted from the past, and that gets me super excited.
And one of the things I want to dive into, which was brought up a little bit earlier, which is the notion of like, hey, let's grow really fast and then, we'll get sued at some point. So Brock, I wanted to take this one, which is the idea of like, how important is privacy, IP, and all those things taken into consideration when you're looking at investing and you're saying, well, I can see this happening down the line, but the company is growing and there looks like there's a lot of potential.
Yeah, again, I will take a product hat as versus investment hat. I believe it depends on the industry. There are now some fundamental shifts that I think it will probably be solved by regulation, that things that were considered Creative Commons, meaning if it's in public domain, it could be crawled, being challenged. For example, out of the blue, Reddit is saying, oh, you need to pay me, or I will restrict access, and obviously Twitter restricting access to API, and then Meta creates threads, etc. So there's a lot of stuff going on. Generally speaking, my feeling is that I'm pretty skeptical that the courts, at least in the US, will adopt an approach of, yes, it's in public domain, but you cannot use it. So I think that will be hard. But there is a web of IP protection laws in different states, different countries that might create a real issue in some verticals, not all of them, some verticals. In that regard, back to my point, entertainment will always lead the way for good and for bad. Somebody from entertainment will adopt something like, Grimes said, go ahead, create a deep fake of my voice, just pay me 50%. She doesn't need to ask anyone because her rights are owned by her. But most of the rights owned by studios. On the bad side, studios will sue everyone. They will try to sue everyone. And I believe in that regard, fortunately, unfortunately, players like Google or Meta has an advantage, because I want to see somebody try to tell Google, don't train on my data. And Google will say, okay, fine, I will respect it, but I'll not crawl your data. How many clients like Reddit or Stack Overflow can live without traffic from Google? So in that regard, I think big players that have a lot of consumers will benefit from it, both how much they need to pay and the leverage they have. But in some industries, it will be more important than in others.
Okay, so one of the last questions that I have here before we go to the audience for questions is this idea of growth and optimizing for growth. When you think of different waves, like you had the crypto wave, you had the internet boom, and it's like, hey, we're just going to optimize for growth, and then we're going to figure out profitability later. I want to get your guys' opinion on how important is growth versus profitability right now.
So I will say the pendulum consistently keeps swinging on this one, right? And it's every couple of years, VCs love growth at all costs. And every couple of years, they're like, profitability, that's the most important thing. I think the reality, and now we've just had this massive correction that's happened. There's been so much emphasis put on profitability versus growth. But I would leave you with this guidance, which is regardless of what's happening in the macro environment, growth is important. But if you're spending $3 to acquire $1 of revenue, not a super sustainable business model long term, right? If you're doing that in the short term because of compute costs, because of XYZ, but you think once you reach economies of scale, it will become less than a 1-to-1 burn multiple, then sure, that's totally fine at the seed Series A, Series B stage. But as you start to reach scale, I think efficient growth is always going to be critical, right? Venture markets also are sort of like this pendulum. Sometimes they're very accessible, like in 2021 timeframe, it was super accessible. And sometimes they feel very closed. In the last year, it's been relatively closed, especially at the growth stage, right? So you want to be able to build a business where you don't have to depend on external capital at any given point in time, if you can do it without that, right? Now, of course, that's not to say you're creating a lifestyle business and not a venture backable business, but you want to always be thinking about profitability. It's not you sacrifice profitability for growth at all costs, or you never grow and you're just looking at the bottom line and then you're not thinking about how to build your product. So my answer is both are sort of equally important in building a massive company, right? And so I would pay close attention to it. And you don't always have to solve for a 1-to-1 multiple, right? Like $1 of revenues, $1 of costs. But you want to assess where you are in the company life cycle and company journey and toggle accordingly and know your levers of the business so well that if you need to, you can make those changes in real time.
I would agree with everything that you said, and I just want to add a little bit of color. From an investor perspective, where as a fund manager, we're responsible for delivering certain target return rate, and right now, because of the macroeconomic environment, when your risk-free rate is at 5.5%, et cetera, then it needs to have incremental justification as to why a fund should deploy, to you, et cetera. And so from this perspective, a lot of times when I talk to a lot of founders, I tell them that right now, what's really important is that, number one, you survive. It's not just the macroeconomic environment that affects you, it affects everyone out there, right? So what previously was, in 2020 to 2022, when a lot of corporations and buyers are willing to spend, it was a little bit easier for growth, et cetera. But because now everybody is a bit more conservative, and with that, what's more important is that that the companies survive right now and wait for a better time. On top of that, just going back to what you said about how much you spend to acquire each customers, et cetera. Number one, if that gets rampant, it gets harder to justify for raising the next round, right? What we've been seeing, in the last couple of years is that there were these mega rounds that's being done, and because of that, it gets a bit harder to hit metrics for the next round of financing, right? And so all of this kind of moves in a pipeline, and so right now it's a bit of a bottleneck right now. So that's just my perspective.
I think those are amazing points. I just wanted to add, if you, like, a lot of people say we're hitting a recession, but if you look at 2000, like the dot-com boom and stuff, like a lot of the big companies like the Googles of the world, the Amazons of the world, a lot of that whole generation of companies came from that time, was started around that time. So, I mean, who knows? Like, people think we're hitting a recession now, but all I want to say, it's that winning spirit to keep going, and something's definitely going to come about it. It seems like a lot of big, great companies are born in the times of recession. So even though there's hesitancy, I think definitely having a sustainable model, but also having a winning mindset is critical. So I just want to definitely emphasize on that. If you look at back in the days, Google almost got acquired by Yahoo and it didn't work out. And then fast forward now, like everyone knows Google is one of the biggest companies in the world and has kind of taken that entire business that Yahoo had. So just having that winning mindset and just keep going through all the hard times and you will be successful.
I love it. Let's go to the audience for questions and we'll rock and roll from there.
What do you think the next generation of products will look like, especially applied to other verticals like blockchain? Because it was blockchain, then AI. Some people think it's exclusive because AI is a lot about data, so it's a lot about centralization to have huge amounts of data, and blockchain is a lot about decentralization in the sense that you earn things from your computer, per se. So how do you think they can work together?
Hey, I think I know you. Nice to see you. So I think that there's a thesis developing, crossing between AI and Web3 right now, especially around the likes of deepfakes, et cetera, especially with the newer generative AI models, et cetera. Like some of the speakers have said about how IP rights is becoming really important. There are songs that were created that seemingly seems to be produced by Drake and the likes of that, but it's not actually. And so what I see is that blockchain, based on the immutability of data, that could be a really interesting aspect. On top of that, because of the way that smart contracts are composable to one another, et cetera, there is also a way to tackle it through the creation what's called system of engagement intelligence, right? In which case you can have one AI model working with another one on-chain, right? Leveraging that capability. So those are some of the interesting narratives I've been seeing.
Yeah, I also want to make sure, and maybe it will disappoint you, that I think a lot of next generation products will not involve blockchain. That's just reality. But back to piggyback on what you asked, if that's kind of your area of interest, another area that smart contracts to blockchain, not crypto blockchain, might be interesting is tracking the rights IP rights. For example, if model is trained and you use multiple songs to create a new song, how it's a crazy, complex question, who is actually getting paid? And that's where I think blockchain can potentially be very relevant as well.
How in the payment system, like how specifically in the payment system? Can you like just give one example?
Yeah, so what the examples that I gave, and obviously it's still high level, is that in entertainment system, if you have a model that has millions of songs and you generate a new song and the song gets royalties, how do you distribute royalties, right? How it's done, that's where blockchain could potentially work. It's a complex topic because it's not like that's a derivative of multiple things. And the way LLMs work is like human brain. It's like my 9-year-old, when he says something, I don't know what he says something wrong or right. I don't know what algorithm, what made it. Like neural networks work differently, but there is something there to potentially explore.
I want to mention one more idea, is that this one, I almost forgot about it, but it's extremely interesting to me, per se. And that is in Web3, I think one of the magic power there is the use of token to incentivize the network. And what I've been seeing right now is that there's this one company called Jensen that's backed by A16Z recently. They're in UK. And what they're doing is to use token incentivized network in order to have nodes parked on the network in order for you to train your model. That way, because you're using commodity hardware as opposed to some of the latest and greatest GPUs, et cetera, it's able to reduce the cost by an estimate of 80%. And so because of that, that lowers the cost for AI startups, et cetera. Just wanted to mention that, something I almost forgot.
Well, as a small business owner, I feel or I have this intuition that there is a huge problem with people that are creating these LLMs because on one side, when the investor asks to see the technology, well, it doesn't work that well because they don't have the money for paying the GPUs necessary for doing the process and the data. And on the other side, well, the technology is not working well because there's no money, therefore there's no funding because the technology is not working well. Right, so it's like a vicious circle. I would like to know your input on this, how to get out of it, the problem I'm having right now. I would love to hear your opinions.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would necessarily agree with this constraint because I think the one thing that OpenAI did is they put a nice UI on an LLM that is already trained well and then spent a lot of money on it and got a lot of money, obviously. But now you can basically pay $20 or a month, and you can try. Now, granted, it's probably more playing, and if you need to go to hyperscale, that's expensive, but that's a good problem to have. I'm sure there's enough investors that if the use case is getting millions of users with the right business model, it will be funded. So I think the democratization of AI coming from those models, there are many of them available, right? The easiest way to start is just to use this huge foundational model. It's easy to start. That's the beauty. Now we're getting into real multiplier effect of a cloud infrastructure, right? Now, if you have more complex needs, if the cost is an issue, you might need to invest in a team that will basically take an open source model and fine tune it. And as I said, it's a still complex engineering problem, but it's not unsolvable problem.
So there are advances in, for example, fine-tuning, et cetera, with, I think, this model called LoRa that's coming out, basically able to incrementally train against the model, or the data, rather. There's also various cloud providers, such as Azure, AWS, GCP, that are able to give credit for you to try out their infrastructure, et cetera. Because that's one of the ways that they build moat, is so that your code sits up there, right? And you wouldn't migrate it. It's painful. So there are these, and one of the ways to do is that you can build it based on a small data set, train it, demonstrate what it can do before you seek further funding and so on and so forth, basically get investors buy-in, all of that. So that's another way to pursue it.
Okay. We have one more question. PhDs, the new bachelors, and new companies formed today are going to be having employees that are going to generate $10 million per employee. And that basically means the footprint or size of these new companies is going to be significantly smaller, which is going to lead to lesser, smaller future workforce opportunities. which is going to create a lot of society problems. Are you concerned about this?
So personally speaking, I think that whenever we have technological innovations, it also creates industries in the periphery, right? For example, right now, we need a lot of people for data labeling. There are a lot of different kinds of services being built. For example, I believe vector databases, there's a lot of those that are open source right now. There are a lot of developers contributing to that. So I think that there's, yes, one part of the workforce might have some of their responsibilities automated, et cetera, but it also creates others based on new technologies and so on and so forth.
Yeah, there's two aspects to it, and I was born in Russia, communist Russia, so I am painfully aware when a technological revolution happens and some people left behind, what could happen. So I think we should definitely not ignore it. But if you look at the macro level, that's not the first wave of technological innovation that creates automation. It started with knitting press, and then it went to, steam engine, etc. At the end of the day, if you look at quality of life that was created by technology and wealth that was created by technology, it's for everyone, at least in developed world, everyone on average are better off. Yes, there are inequality, how this wealth will be distributed, and yes, there is always jobs that will become less important or more important, but please don't forget that it will create a lot of new type of jobs that we're not even aware. If you look today, 60% of jobs that we have today didn't exist in 1940. That said, back to my point, this transition is very hard. It could take a generation for people to transition, and it's very important to understand and provide enough support. We don't want to add in a situation of, again, I had a very good colleague, Ray Kurzweil, who's considered one of the most amazing futurists. He was sharing an office with me at Google, and he always told me that if people would hear that in 1910, when you had 25% of population working on manufacturing, and I believe 12% working 25 in agriculture, I think also 25 in manufacturing, that in 2010 it will be 2% in agriculture, and 9% manufacturing would say, oh my God, we'll all die, there'll be a ton of unrest, etc. We figured it out, but on the flip side, my response to Ray Kurzweil was yes, but during this time we had a huge revolutions and 2 world wars on the way, right? So it's important to understand and important to support people during this transition.
Right. I mean, to build off of that, in some ways I do agree with what you're saying. I will say, though, that since the pandemic, we've seen the potential of people to be able to work remotely, work from anywhere. And what I do think this next wave of innovation allows for is talent that historically may not have even had access into certain parts of the workforce to be fully unlocked and tapped. So in some ways, it's actually redistribution of equity and redistribution of wealth and leveraging the historically unaccessible talent now all of a sudden becomes accessible across the world, right? So in some ways, yes, I agree with you, but in other ways, there's ways to combat that.
All righty, and that's a wrap for the VC panel. Let's give a warm round of applause to the panelists again. Once again, that's Priya Sai Prasad from the SoftBank Vision Fund, formerly of Mayfield Fund and M12, Microsoft Venture Fund. And we have Akush Srikant, product exec at Workday, Barak Turovsky, executive in residence at Scale Venture Partners, and Richard Chen, who is venture partner at Primer SAS and also co-founder of Iterative Ventures. So let's give them a warm round of applause.